that we would love in a sense to do on a Sunday morning, but you can factor in kind of the allocation of time plus the kind of the format of being able to do the Q&A and just really kind of unpack a little bit more kind of these conversations. It's why we choose kind of a special night of the week. And so I want to thank you for making the sacrifice to be a part of that. And I do want to start tonight. You're kind of in part two of a two-part conversation called, part one was how did we get here? And it was a study of kind of the history of, particularly our racial history in Baltimore City, which is really an American story. Baltimore story is really an American story. Tonight we're going to go for that perspective of where do we go from here. And so again, if you missed part one, it's not going to be a big deal. There might be a topic or two that you kind of, what was he talking about here? But by and large, this is really kind of an application conversation. You can go back and watch part one if you'd like to later on. I want to start this way though. I want to read Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? And it goes like this. Austin is actually going to have a little animation here behind me. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side." But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave him to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told them, "Go and do likewise." All right, that's Luke 10, 25 through 37. We're here tonight to figure out how to go and do likewise. Right? The ethnic enemy of the half-beaten, left-for-dead Jewish person on the road is the person Jesus elevates in this story and says to the audience of people, or to the man in particular he's conversing with, "Go and do likewise." And tonight is about actually seeing, not just being busy doing Christian things, right? Or religious things, or even good person humanitarian things, because certainly the priest and the Levite are 2 people who would be notable in their communities for doing good religious humanitarian-based things. But they're not the people that Jesus elevates in this story. We want to actually feel rather than blame, right? The story Jesus talks about is a notable road. It's a dangerous road in the ancient world. It's the type of road where 2 questions get asked frequently. Number 1, why would you ever walk on that road by yourself? It's a dangerous road. And second, what kind of person makes a road like this that's so volatile and dangerous that people can't even walk down it? Tonight we want to move past the finger pointing and the blame and actually feel. Get down off the donkeys. And then lastly, we want to actually act. We want to get down and invest. We want to talk about our oil and our wine, our bandages, our credit, our relationships to innkeepers that might help us leverage relationship to people who are hurting. We're here tonight to figure out what it means to go and do likewise. And a recurring word we're going to use tonight, it's in your notes, is empathy. The ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So not just feeling sorry about the things that are going on, but really going, what do we do about the things that are going on in a way that we have the ability to understand and a way that we have the ability to share the feelings in, okay? So here's kind of a central premise, and if you're not a person of faith or you're here tonight and you're exploring Christianity, I'll ask this question to you, although I'm really directing it kind of at the heart of the church, meaning this: when you think about the problems going on in the world today, do you think the church should be part of the solution? Right? Just list them off in your head. Think of all the isms. Think of all the things that are on fire, metaphorically or literally, and think to yourself, do you think that the church should be part of the solution, the shalom, the restoration in those particular things? My guess is most of you, with maybe an exception or two, you would go, yeah, of course. And so for the conversation of race, a poll was taken amongst evangelicals. And I don't particularly like that word evangelical right now in the current climate of things, but by this tone, what evangelical would mean for the purpose of this poll is a person who ascribes to a theology or a worldview that says, I am a born-again Christian and I attend a born-again Christian Protestant church or Catholic church in some sort of level of frequency, to be determined by that particular person, okay? So that could be twice a year, it could be twice every 6 years. It's just an identification for the sake of a poll, okay? And so in that particular poll, a question was asked of the people participating that identified as evangelical. 95% of those self-identified evangelicals said the church should be playing a critical role in racial reconciliation. That number actually shocked me. While only 73% of the general public thought the church, capital C church, not the Foundry Church, but the capital C church, had anything to do with that particular topic. So 22% more kind of from the evangelical world go, hey, when it comes to things like racial reconciliation, the capital C church should be on the front lines of being part of the solution there. 95%. But then another question in that same kind of series of questions was asked, and get this. And if you were part of part one, then you'll understand kind of the dissonance that exists here. The second question asked was, are people of color placed at societal disadvantages in our country? Of the 95% that said yes, racial reconciliation should be part of the vision of the church, only 56% saw any disadvantages for people of color in our country. While the 73% that said, hey, the church should have a role, 67% of those said, oh yeah, we see it. We see disadvantage, we see dissonance, we see the problem. And that poll right there sort of exposes kind of the essence of tonight, okay? We may not agree on every solution. We may not agree on every kind of pathway to healing. Some of us might be thinking about reconciliation. I mean, even the term reconciliation maybe for you might be loaded, because is that interpersonal, right? Is that in my relationship, or is that structural, or is that just kind of an individual thing? Like, hey, I've got friends that don't look like me, that don't come from my story or my background. Tonight, we're going to try to ask the question of what does it mean for the church to be part of the solution, to be part of Plan A? If you missed our time together in Urbanology Part 1, and you can watch the video of this, you can go back at foundrybaltimore.com/urbanology, and I suggest that you would. You missed a conversation that really sort of aimed to show how even neutral, good, well-intentioned ideas in the city of Baltimore had a disproportionately harmful effect on minorities and the poor in our city. Right? That there were even if we just assume the most positive and pure of intentions, that no one set out to hurt anyone else, that there was real structural disadvantages and hurts that came forth in our city, and that you and I are sitting here today whatever position we find ourselves, whether we're amongst the rich or we consider ourselves, hey man, if you saw my bankroll, I'm on the poor side of this, right? If you hey, I'm about as pasty white as they come, or not so much. The reality is we need to move forward in some direction. I love the words of Mark Demaz. He says, the credibility of the American church is virtually non-existent in the eyes of a society when it comes to addressing racial rifts, systemic inequalities, or cultural divides deeply affecting the U.S. today. So our premise with Urbanology is that we should be in the middle of this, that we should live out truth humbly, that we should be open to learning, and that we should walk out these hard conversations in difficult rooms like this one, okay? And as we kind of bring the end to kind of the intro portion of the night, there's three things we're gonna kind of refuse to let be the solution. Three things we're going to refuse to let be the solution tonight. That's kind of the premise of this whole thing, that we're going to refuse to viewing this something as being it's behind us, okay? That one of the admissions of tonight is we don't live in a post-racial society. And if you think we live in a post-racial society, you've been asleep. You've been Rip Van Winkling 2017, okay? The second is that the thing we have to reject is that this is something that will be fixed only if, and just only if, other people that aren't you take more responsibility, right? So we're rejecting the notion that if everyone else just tried harder, but if you stayed where you were tonight, the problem would get better. And then a third thing we're going to reject tonight, tempting though it might be for some of you, is that if you just got your party in office, that if there was just a perfect ticket of your favorite candidates with your favorite platforms and your favorite policies, that if we could just line those things straight down the straight street, that we'd have the solution, right? There's going to be plenty of people talking into microphones like me that are going to promise that that's the solution. But what we're going to reject as the body of Christ tonight is that is it a straight government ticket or just one unilateral policy will solve all of this. And that actually conversations about reconciliation are way messier than that. And conversations about how we move forward are way messier than just, well, so vote blank. Okay, so what do we go from here? What do we go from here? Where do we go from here is what I'm trying to say. Tonight, here's the format and the flow. Austin Hedge is our associate minister at the Foundry. He's going to lead us through some conversations. I'm Scott Ancaro. I'm going to lead us through some of our conversations. And then our friend Jordan Rice is appearing live via, pre-recorded interview. It was live for Austin and I back in September. And Jordan's role is this. Jordan is a lawyer, and Jordan is a church planter in Harlem, New York. He's a friend of the Foundry. He graduated from Morgan State in Baltimore, so he knows our city pretty well, and was very eager to participate, though he couldn't be here live this evening. And so we went up to Harlem, good excuse to go hang out in a cool neighborhood in Harlem where Jordan lives, and really just kind of pick his brain about some of the things that we're unpacking together tonight. So the question of where do we go from here is a question I asked Jordan, and this is his answer, and this will get us started.
So yeah, where do you go from here? I think the first thing is to resist every temptation for a quick resolution. Our society cherishes microwave solutions to monumental problems, and that's just a really bad solution. I was talking to a friend who was really just disturbed by the injustices we have in this country, and was just really disturbed in general. And she was like, what should we do? What should we do? What should we do? And I was like, hey, if you're feeling bad, welcome to the party. Welcome to the party. Black and brown people have felt uncomfortable in this country for the last 500 years. And it's quite honestly, it's a privilege to think that you shouldn't feel uncomfortable in America. So first thing I would say is get some water, get a Snicker bar, and sit down and get ready for a long road ahead. It's not going to get a quick resolution tomorrow by a couple of tweets. Some sort of political rally is not going to solve a centuries-old problem. Second thing I would say is identification is the single most powerful tool you will have that will deconstruct things inside of you and will allow you to see from a different vantage point, which is so necessary to develop empathy in your life. There's a story in this book called Blind Spot where the author tells a story about two Yale doctors. Both of the doctors in this situation are white, so it's not a race-based example. One of the doctors is like a history professor. She cuts her hand doing dishes, and she goes to the hospital, Yale Hospital, and she's with one of her friends, and her friend goes to the doctor and says, hey, she loves to crochet, so can you please make sure that you get her a really good doctor to fix her hand? Doctor says, don't worry, ma'am, we'll get her a good doctor, and kind of brushes her off. As she's turning the hallway in her wheelchair, getting ready to go for pre-op, one of the residents sees her and says, like, oh, like Dr. So-and-so, she was my humanities professor. And then the hand specialist looks and says, oh, you're a doctor at Yale? She says, yes. And he says, all right, great. Cancel the other guy and calls in the foremost hand specialist in Connecticut. The only thing that changed was now he can identify with her that, hey, she's a Yale doctor just like I'm a Yale doctor. We're both part of this Yale club, and I'm going to go out of my way to help her out. Most people aren't racist in the sense that they're walking around with torches and driving a car through crowds of people. Nobody's doing that for the most part. But people are not going out of their way to serve other people, and I think it's because they can't identify with them. You can identify with someone by putting yourself in their shoes, by going to where they go, by living life among them, not for a week, a month, but by deeply investing yourself in the ordinary rhythms of those people, and slowly but surely you'll be able to identify with people, having people at your dinner table that are different from you. Not just once so it looks good, you can put on Instagram, but over and over and over again, putting yourself in difficult situations where you start to develop different connections and different circles of people whereby you can actually hear their stories, and people who are different than you start to identify with them in a more powerful way. Then and only then people really develop a deeper sense of empathy that these are not issues, that this is not a us and them anymore, but this is a name to it. This is a family. This is someone you can identify with. And I just think that has to be the thing that breaks down doors. And the church is I think the only place that we can actually get that in, because the gospel brings us all to the foot of the cross with nothing in our hands.
We think the church is plan A in moving this needle a little bit closer in this conversation about identification. And really kind of stepping into the world of other people. So it's not an us and them, but so that we can step in and go and do likewise. And so that's where we're going tonight. I don't know if you came in this room cynical. I don't know if you came in this room confused. I don't know if you came in this room like eager for quick lists of solutions. What I'd like to do with whatever posture you brought into this room is move you a little bit closer to the go and do likewise in Luke chapter 10, okay? That means, though, we're going to have to start to confront that thing that you came in here feeling, right? Which is just an ordinary day for you going from Jerusalem to Jericho when you encounter a person laying bloody on the road, right? An inconvenient reality. Two of the three people keep going. Because the thing that they're dealing with is too preoccupying to move them off of their donkey, okay? I know we've got this third guy. Austin's going to take it from here, and its next section going to share with us what the distinction between the identification, the thing that moves us kind of to stop and do more than notice, but actually be part of the solution. So take it away, sir.
So, when we talk about bias and empathy, those are kind of the buzzwords for tonight. Where we want to start is just being able to admit that we have biases. Each one of us walk into this room and we have thoughts of other people, and we see people at work, and the first time you meet someone, initially things pop into your head about what you think about who they are. And if we want to even begin to get to action, to empathy, we first need to establish that we have that. I'm a person that sometimes likes definitions just to help us clear the table and understand exactly what we're talking about. So I looked up the definition of bias just so we have a framework for conversation. And it's this: bias is a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one that's preconceived. So we walk into a room, we see someone, immediately a thought pops in our mind that that's who they are. We figured them out. We've put them in a box. There's a game, I don't know if you've ever heard of this. I've never heard of this, but when I was researching this, I came across this game called lawn bowling. And apparently in this game, they have these balls they call biased balls that they use, and it's the main thing that they play with. And the thing that's interesting about them is that they're not like a soccer ball where there's equal weight kind of throughout and it's evenly distributed. Instead, there's one side that's more weighted. And so you can get all kinds of wonky movement when you throw it, right? And the reality is, I think that's an interesting way to even think about our own biased tendencies, is that, when we walk into a room, when we meet someone, we may be weighted in a certain direction. We may naturally just lean a certain way. And sometimes that takes us in ways that we don't want it to, or we're surprised that it does. Take, for example, the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus doesn't share with us exactly why the first two men continue walking, but the fact that they do continue walking forces us kind of to ask the question of why. And I think one of the most commonly held ideas here is that this Samaritan was a person that was unclean. He was a race they didn't associate with. And so they chose, we're just going to walk right around him and just keep going. Someone that didn't jive with them, and so they chose not to stop. But they had these tendencies and this bias before they got on this road. They walked into the situation with this viewpoint. Whether they knew it or not, they kind of stepped up to this person and saw him and made a decision in that moment that he wasn't worth helping. So they went around. So our first session of Urbanology, Dr. DeVos talked about systemic issues, focusing on sometimes even, as Scott was saying, we have good intentions. And when we have good intentions, sometimes we put in systems, and sometimes those systems have issues to them. In the same way that sometimes we have good intentions with our relationships, and sometimes those good intentions don't end up being so great. Because we bring our biases to the table each and every time we're in relationships with one another. So Jordan's going to talk about this in a video where he talks about an experience he had while he was practicing law.
So yeah, when I first started practicing law, one of my first cases was a kid that got caught with a BB gun, bringing it to school, stole it from his dad. Parents had no idea that he brought it to class. And then kid was getting jumped and, scared, brought the BB gun to school to kind of ward off the bullies, and gets picked up. In this day and age, obviously, it's a scary thing to see any sort of weapon. Went in front of the judge, and the judge was very sympathetic and, saw the kid and realized that he wasn't a bad person with terrible motives. He wasn't trying to rob anybody. He was just a stupid kid, made a stupid mistake. Judge gave him a slap on the wrist. The county attorney, who was offering the deal, so to speak, agreed with everybody. He wasn't trying to prosecute the case. Everybody just really let it go like it was nothing, gave him a slap on the wrist. A few months later, same courtroom, same county attorney, and different race. A kid brought a BB gun to school. First offense, just like everybody else, but the judge and the county attorney were not nearly as sympathetic to his case. And instead of trying to give him a slap on the wrist, the county attorney wanted to give him 2 years in juvie. And I remember asking the judge off the record, Your Honor, I can't believe we're doing this. This is not how this court runs. And the judge was defensive. Don't tell me how this court runs. And he stepped back. And I remember stepping back and then just shaking my head in just disbelief. Same case. Both kids brought a BB gun to school. Both kids, it was a first offense. Neither one of them had any record whatsoever. It was almost identical in every way, except for one kid was white, the other kid was black. And I remember that being one of the moments where I was just, A, enraged, and B, just in some ways speechless, thinking about this is the way that people are treated in this country in 2000, whatever year, in New York, the most progressive place on the planet, allegedly. That kids are still getting a raw deal, literally. I got the kid off anyway, but that's always stuck out to me. Just even when we say we have a system that treats people fairly, impartially, we don't. Technically, our judicial system is set up really well. I mean, to have juries. But once upon a time, there were no juries, and there was just this one judge who decided the fate of everybody. And if the judge was corrupt, whether for money or whatever reason, then you were just completely in a terrible situation. So having juries was a great idea, but oftentimes jurors, people, they don't know what type of biases they bring into the courtroom, and it's not a mystery why juries are far more likely to hand out guilty verdicts for African American clients versus white clients, or in particular, why they're far less likely to hand out a guilty verdict to someone of their own race versus someone else. And in our legal system, there's so many biases that people bring into the courtroom, that we bring into every aspect of our life, because we all have biases, all of us, every single last one of us.
So obviously here, Jordan is talking about a system that, he experienced while practicing law, where in the courtroom, you have these juries and you have people there, but everyone there brings in a lot with them. They bring in their childhood experiences. They bring in the neighborhood they grew up in, the city they grew up in, everything they walk into that jury room with. And if we want to take this step to finding out what our different biases are and being able to admit them, we first have to just admit that they exist in this world. We have to acknowledge the realities of this world. We have to acknowledge the realities of where we live in our city, and we have to acknowledge the realities of our own heart and where we are individually. So kind of for this next little portion, we're going to get a little bit more interactive, because otherwise you guys will fall asleep and you guys will just be falling, with your head down. So I'm going to ask a quick question, and we'll talk a little bit about this. And I want you just to raise your hand when you feel like the answer describes you the best, all right? So the question is this: how often do you give answers that are untrue? All right? How often do you give answers that are untrue? If you're a person that you say all the time, go ahead and just stick your hand up, which no one's going to, because you'll feel uncomfortable and everyone will look at you, right? How about often? I often give answers that are untrue. No? Sometimes? Like 50? Rarely. How about rarely? And never. Anyone say never? Anyone brave enough? Nah. So often we find ourselves kind of in those last couple of categories because we see ourselves as pretty honest people, right? Each one of us probably would describe ourselves as an honest person. Maybe we even are viewing that question as, how often do I deliberately lie or consciously make the decision to deceive someone else? But if we were honest with ourselves, there's more of a spectrum to lying, right? In this book, Blind Spot, which Jordan alluded to earlier, it's in your notes that you guys can check that out. There's an entire chapter devoted to the different types of lies we tell ourselves and tell other people. So one of the lies that they suggest that we tell is what we call a white lie. You guys have all heard of white lies. They're pretty harmless. When someone comes up to you and asks you, well, how are you doing? Anyone here tell the truth all the time when someone asks you, how are you doing? Or your wife comes up to you and asks you a question about her body and how she looks in jeans. You're going to tell the truth that she wants to hear, right? But it's a white lie. They're harmless, we feel like. There's a bit darker the next level, but they're similar, called gray lies. These are lies that are more shaped by sparing someone's feelings, trying to avoid different conflict, right? So you're walking down the street, you leave here afterwards, and a man who is homeless approaches you. And he asks you the question, do you have any change that I could have, or do you have $1 that I could have? And maybe he gives you a long spiel as to what he's going to do with it. And often, what is our response? I don't have any cash on me. Even though a lot of times we do. Even though there's a lot of times where maybe he even will come up to us and say, I'm hungry. And you're standing in front of a restaurant, yet we choose to lie and say we can't help you out. It's a gray lie. It's a little bit worse than a white lie in our minds. The next one is this. It's what they call a colorless lie. So what these colorless lies are, essentially are lies that we don't even realize we are telling, which is scary. But it's factual. We do this all the time, too. right? So we go to the doctor, you're filling out the sheet of paper, and one of the things that it says on there is, how many drinks a day do you have? And you write down 2 drinks, because to you drink 2 drinks a day. But we don't even realize that sometimes maybe that our ways of measuring that is different than the standard. And actually, we pour double what the standard is. So really, we have 4 drinks a day, but we just lied on those pieces of paper. And we didn't even realize it. There's another one they talk about called blue lies, which they describe as essentially being mostly truthful or essentially truthful, but not actually true. Right? Someone comes up to you on election day or the day after, and they ask you the question of, did you vote? And you didn't vote because you're busy, you had stuff going on, but you're the type of person that votes. So you say, yeah, I voted, right? You know what I'm talking about. You know, someone sitting in your car, they ask you what kind of music you listen to, and if they flip through your dials, it's like, oh, here's pop music, and here's pop music, and here's pop music, but you answer something else because you know that they would be more, it would cause you more of an advantage with them and leave a better impression, right? These are blue lies. These are lies that we probably tell often too, that we don't realize. See, and these 4 types of lies don't even go into other lies that I think are more socially acceptable lies, right? You know, you go, maybe you've worked as a waiter or waitress or bartender, and you get cash tips. Maybe we lie on our taxes about whether or not we got those cash tips. Or if you've been out of the country, and I know they just lifted this ban not too long ago, but you go down to the Caribbean, you're like, I want to take back a cigar with me, and then you're filling out the paperwork, and you're like, I didn't bring a cigar back with me, because you don't want to claim that you brought a Cuban cigar back with you. These are more socially acceptable lies for a lot of us. And so if we go back to this question as far as how often we're untrue, it's probably a lot higher than we realize for every one of us, which makes us each feel uncomfortable. In the same way, I think that this applies to our biased tendencies. Each one of us would answer in the same way that maybe sometimes my bias affects the way that I talk to someone or view someone, maybe rarely, but the reality is it probably has a bigger foothold in our life than we even realize, in the same way that these lies do. So we're going to do an activity, get you thinking a little bit, to get you thinking about those different tendencies. On your piece of paper, there should be some room. I want you just to number it 1 to 10 real quick, and I'll tell you what we're going to do. So over the next minute or so, what we're going to do is I'm going to put a photo up on the screen, and I want you to think of the first attribute that pops in your mind or characteristic that pops in your mind about this person. And try to avoid demographics. Don't put a race, don't put age, don't put male, female. Avoid those things. Just characteristic. What do you notice about this person? And we're going to go through them pretty quick. We've got 10 of them, and I'm going to try to do it in like a minute. So we're not going to go back. If you miss it, just be mindful. Write down the first thing you think of. So Scott's going to put the first one up here. All right, let's do the second one. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. All right, number 6. Number 7. All right, number 8. Number 9. And number 10. This guy's head's cut off a little bit. All right, who found that easy to do? I mean, other than keeping up with my pacing. Yeah? It's pretty easy. Throw someone's photo in front of you and immediately you can come up with a characteristic or a story about them. So we like to do that. We like to figure out who people are, right? That's what we're doing here. All right, here's the next activity, all right? Kind of off to the side there, I want you to write the numbers 1 through 5. And don't worry, we won't have you share your 10 things that you thought of someone, your gut reaction. You can go home and share that with whoever you came with, so. All right, so you got the numbers 1 through 5. For this one, I'm going to ask you, with some of these same people that we just saw here, I'm going to ask you a question, and it'll be a photo of 2 of them. And just pick. Pick which one you think fits the answer better. All right, so Scott, you can put the first 2 up. All right, if you're choosing the guy on the left, just put an L. Guy on the right, put an R, right? Which one of these 2 seems more trustworthy to you? All right, next photo. A little cut off, but you remember their faces. Which one of these 2 would you want to hire? Next one. Which one of these 2 do you think is more aggressive? A little slower to answer that one. All right, the next one. Which one of these 2 would you rather have dinner with? And the last one. Which one of these 2 do you think is more successful? All right, so this one we're gonna show a little bit of our answers a little bit more. So, Scott, if you want, go ahead and throw the first one up there. The question here was, who do you think is more trustworthy? If you said guy on the left here, this guy, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, how about guy on the right? Raise your hand. Okay. All right, let's do the next photo. Which one of these 2 would you want to hire? We have the lady on the left here. Raise your hand if that was it. Wow, big. Guy on the right with the tattoos and the long hair and the piercings. Right. All right, next one. Which one is more aggressive? The lady on the left here? Yeah? And how about the gentleman on the right? Yeah? All right, and the next one. Who would you rather have over for dinner? How about the elderly lady on the left? And the beautiful model on the right, probably. Right? And the next one, who is more successful? So the gentleman on the left here and the lady on the right. So immediately we can come up with these answers, right? That one maybe was a little bit harder because you're having to decide between the 2, and it's not like necessarily we had major distinctions between the 2, but we still can make those distinctions pretty quickly. And the interesting thing, I don't know if you looked around the room, minus the second question of who would you like to hire, it was kind of split pretty evenly on most of the rest of them, where half of the room said, this guy is more successful, and half the room said, this lady's more successful. And a lot of that is just dependent on, our upbringing, our biases that we bring into the situation, where we make these split-second decisions on who someone is. We box them in pretty quickly. And I think that's something that we have to be honest about. It should scare us a little bit that we do that just so quickly. We decide who someone is, and then a lot of times we get in a relationship with someone and we realize they are nothing like who I thought they were. Right? Maybe that's just me. Maybe that just happens to me. These activities were a little heavier, so we're going to do something that's a little lighter, just so we can laugh a little bit. So I found this slideshow online that I thought was kind of interesting about a week ago. And basically what it was it took a photo, and it basically was like one photo to describe every single state, right? So you get clicking through them, and there's like Idaho, and it's a sign that's like attractions, and nothing's on the sign, right? And you get going through them, and you're laughing at the different ones. So I decided, let me take some of the people out of those, and I'll just see how many of those we can identify. All right, so Scott, throw up the first one. Just yell it out if you know what state this is. New Jersey, right? Yeah. All right, how about the next one? What state is this? This is an Amish lady, her head's cut off. Pennsylvania. See, we're good at this. How about the third one? Texas, yeah. Fourth one. West Virginia. That was impressive, guys. 4 for 4. Collectively as a whole, I think everyone got those. If I would have said city, this may not be West Virginia, this would be? No, city. Pittsburgh, come on. Just kidding, Georges. All right, so that's a little more lighthearted, but we still can make those snap judgments as far as, well, that's where they're from. I know his story. I know the guys before him that looked like they were in the club ready to get their fist pumping, some pit bull, right? Red Bull and vodka kind of guys. Here's another example of that. I found, you guys have maybe seen the judgmental map of Baltimore. We did not create this. I know there's some wording and a lot of judgment on here, obviously. But you read through this, and you may laugh for a moment because you see something that's funny. Or if you're from Canton, you see Fed Hill, and you're like, haha, that's so true. Or if you're from Fed Hill, you see Fells Point, and you're like, that's true too. But what they are is basically we're taking different people, and we're just reducing who they are. And apparently we view the majority of our city as the wire. Not the areas probably most of us live in, but the areas out there. And the interesting thing, I think, too, about this map, you guys can find this online, just judgmental map of Baltimore. The interesting thing, I think, too, is that there's a lot more nuance to the neighborhoods we live in, which is something we like to think of ourselves. We're going to label this entire swath here and this entire swath here, this entire swath here, the apocalyptic zombie zone, zombie land. But, Fed Hill, we've got 3 or 4 different ones. Canton, we've got a handful of different ones. Because we like to think of ourselves as different from the people down the block from us. So that's something, again, I think this is a little bit more lighthearted, but we're still making these snap judgments. We still have these biased tendencies that lead to this, right? We reduce reality a lot of times, and we can make the judgments like this. If we went in reverse order and we said, hey, describe someone from West Virginia, I bet you could. I bet you could come up with your mind about 5 or 6 different characteristics about them. But you may not like that if someone said, describe someone from Maryland. I don't like that as much, right? So we take these characteristics, we take these attributes that we associate, and we put them in a box. We reduce people down to these characteristics rather than actually getting to know them and seeing them as people that are made in the image of God. And if we read through the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 of them, we see Jesus taking time to spend time with people that a lot of the individuals that are around him are going, well, why are you spending time with that person? Because they're in that box, right? We got the political extremists. Don't spend time with him, right? We've got the guy or the ladies over here that are the prostitutes. Don't spend time with them. You'll get in trouble if you spend time with them. These different boxes, the tax collectors, or if we go back to the Samaritan, the ethnic group that we don't talk to. Those are the people we don't talk to. And in many cases, Jesus confronted that. And he said, well, I need to do this. I need to have empathy, and I need to relate to these people. So Scott's going to dive into that next point where we talk about practically what does this look like and how we can take this to the next level.
I want to leave that up for a minute because while it's intended to be humorous, there's the danger, right? Because if I go into Federal Hill looking for frat boys and prostitutes, I will find them. I will, because my eyes will be drawn to find them, right? If I go into West Baltimore looking for the wire, you know what I'll find? I'll find the wire, right? And I will not confront the exceptions, right? But if you come to my neighborhood and go, hey, where the church meets is in rich condo D-bag land. Sorry if that phrasing offends you. I would go, well, I don't think that's what our church is. I'd like to think that I'm the exception because I don't live in a condo and I'm not rich, and I hope the third qualifier doesn't describe me either, right? So this is a really good illustration of the confession of our biases and the danger of the bias in the conversation, right? The reality is, in that conversation initially, if we go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, all three of the guys are carrying a bias, right? The first two have a religious bias. Presumably, they maybe have places to be. Presumably, they may have religious duties to do. The third guy, who's actually the guy that of all of the three should go, I can't go near this situation, this person probably doesn't want me to help, is the person that gets down off of their donkey and does it. If we summarize point one, and you can take this down now at this point, Austin, is that even neutral systems, okay, when invaded by sinners, can become corrupt systems. Right? So even neutral systems, like let's just say for a minute that American democracy is the purest and most awesome form of government the history of the world has ever known, and we cannot critique it or do anything, like it is just, there's nothing. It is the cat's pajamas, man. It's the best thing since Caesar. Even if that would be true, and we go, yeah, absolutely. The fact that you and I are part of that system as sinful human beings corrupts that system. Do you see what we're saying here? That's what we're saying. Is that if your view of the world is corrupted by sin, or even just upbringing, right? In premarital counseling, we do a thing called the genogram. And the genogram is intended to go, this is how your family functioned. Right? If you grew up in a Ravens household, you go, oh, how could anyone ever be a Steelers fan? If you grew up in a Yankees household, you go, oh, how could anyone ever cheer for anyone but the Yankees who've won 27 World Series? All right? You don't do that, right? Like you how would you ever look outside of that? How could anyone look outside of that? I'm going, how could anyone be a Yankee fan? Seriously, right? Because in my family of origin, that was the devil, right? Even neutral systems, when corrupted by upbringing and experiences, become corrupted. And that's point one. And so I hope it lowers your defenses a little bit, because we're not trying to we're both trying to kind of hit you in the stomach here, but we're in it together, all right? And that's what you have to see, is I'm not pointing the finger at, you see this guy up front in the performance vest? He's the problem. We're all the problem when it comes to this conversation. And the question is, are we willing to confront that? All right? James Baldwin says it this way: not everything that's faced can be changed, but without confrontation, nothing changes. Right? Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Sorry, I got ahead of my notes. All three guys see this situation. Jesus tells us, all three of them, none of them is it true that they were like, oh, I don't even know what you're talking about. I was so busy. They all saw a bleeding guy left for dead on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and one guy was willing to confront the bias of busyness, the bias of religious piety, the bias of, I got places to go, I got biases of, I got all of my ceremonial ornate robes on and I can't dirty them with human blood. What will the old ladies at the synagogue think, right? Like, it was one guy who's willing to get down and confront the issue. And so here's the deal. When we talk about biases as it relates to racism or structural sin or any of that stuff, here's what I want to throw out. Okay, we all know that there's like crazy Twitter land of like Holocaust deniers and people that think racism is something that's a good thing and that like slavery should be enlisted again. Like, throw out the crazies for a minute. Okay, throw out the crazies, throw out the exceptions, like throw out what I'm going to call overt racism. It exists, it's real. We're probably not in denial about that, right? Dudes in Charlottesville with pitchforks and torches, like, that's real. Like, I don't think that people in this room anyway are going to debate that. beyond the extremism, it's kind of coming to the place where we're going, okay, if we are coming alongside, if the parable of the Good Samaritan is happening on Route 40 or on Key Highway, where we have a preconception to believe something about a particular group of people, it may expose a blind spot in us. It might expose a precondition, you know. What's distinctive about the Samaritan in this parable is that he, quote, took pity on him. Now we need to think about pity in a different word here. The Greek would not be pitying. The way we kind of use pity is like, it's so sad. It's too bad. Ain't it awful? That's not really what the Greek word here would point to. This would be a movement of compassion. Right? This would be a movement of, again, the ethnic enemy of the person laying on the road who should be rejoicing because, you know, the Samaritans are mudbloods to the Jews. The Samaritans are half-breeds, halflings, half-human, you know, they're not people. I mean, it's even possible that, like, in this scenario, the Jewish person who's just half dead or half alive enough to be like, I don't want a Samaritan kill me. Like, that's a real possibility when this dude gets off the donkey, okay? But the Samaritans saw him and said, I have pity for him. That's what Jesus says. So it wasn't pity that was cliched or trite. It was marked by action and investment. And so if we're coming into this conversation, and this is if point one is kind of the admission that your mind has been skewed by the world you lived in, how you grew up, the experiences you had, point two is going, how do we begin to move from, okay, and the things that are going on in this world, probably some of the admission of, it's so sad, to actually getting off our donkey and doing something. So again, the distinction between sympathy and empathy kind of rises to the surface here. Jordan, take it away.
I think sympathy is a really short-lived emotion that we have. You know, I was walking across the street the other day, and there was like a mouse that got hit by a car. New York City is full of rats. There's a mouse that got hit by a car, and I felt bad for the mouse. I had sympathy for the mouse. I don't like mice. I hate New York City, the fact that we have this many rats and rodents in our city. But I did have real sympathy for the mouse. I don't want it to die on the street like that. Empathy is not even deserving to be in the same paragraph or conversation as sympathy. Sympathy is like brief, it's detached. Empathy is that I now put myself, I can feel what you feel. And empathy is a springboard for action like nothing else. So growing up, my dad was really, really poor. He grew up in a tenement style living in Buffalo in the 50s. And Buffalo was not a great place to live in the 50s for black kids. And he was very poor. Growing up, he only had 2 pairs of pants and 2 shirts. And he talked about how he would just get teased for not having nice shoes or nice sneakers or nice clothes at all. And I remember growing up, for me and my brother, not only did we have nice stuff, but all of the kids on our basketball team, I remember my dad buying everybody, he would buy the whole hood sneakers. And I remember how, like, my dad one time saw a kid that just had some really beat up sneakers, and he was like crying. And he like took him to the store and like got him some nice sneakers. And the thing that motivated my dad to act wasn't that he felt bad for the kid. 1,000 people would have felt bad for him. But my dad saw himself in his shoes. He remembered what he was like when he was a poor kid getting teased. And empathy builds in this experience of this person and I, we're just the same. You know, I could be in that situation in a heartbeat. Empathy builds a deeper identification where you see yourself in that person's story, and it's no longer optional whether or not you'll do something because it deeply affects you. And we need a whole lot more empathy in this world.
So what I think is so interesting about this is like a brilliant story by Jesus. I mean, I'm not being reductionist and like boiling it down to my talking points. Like Jesus, you know, masterful storyteller, obviously. The distinction between sympathy and empathy, all right? The people that should have found it most easy to be empathetic in this scenario keep walking, right? 2 guys that were walking, presumably like the other guy that walked. They're not on a donkey. 2 guys who are of the same ethnic background. also on a dangerous highway are the people that just keep walking. The person who does not have the ability to understand what it means to be walking along this road because he's on a donkey and has at least got a little more mobility and speed to the scenario is the one that gets down, and the one who, again, who is the ethnic enemy of the person laying on the road for dead is the one that gets off of the horse. So the person, or the donkey, the person that is the least likely candidate for empathy in this case is the one that actually demonstrates it. And the other two probably agree that it's awful, agree that it's sad, agree that something should be done, but don't move to do anything. And so empathy, again, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And I'm going to say empathy is really kind of twofold. It's the idea of shared experiences and it's the idea of shared understandings. Right? In other words, if you grew up in Jordan's scenario, if you grew up as like Jordan was describing his father, Jordan's father understood the experience of the young man. He understood what the kid was going through. He had a shared experience. All right? In that situation, empathy's pretty easy. All right? It's not foolproof, as the other two guys in the parable indicate. And it's not beyond the ability to be corrupted, but that's one of the areas where the area of your life where you find it really easy to be empathetic right now is likely someone with whom you share experience, right? If you're in your first year of marriage, you can relate to someone having troubles in their first year of marriage. If you are a Ravens fan, you can commiserate with other Ravens fans right now. If you have to watch the quarterback play of the Ravens, then, you can, okay, I get it, I feel it. Shared experiences. But the second part of this is the harder part, is the shared understanding. What is this person that's on the ground writhing really going through? And when the man on the horse moves past the ideologies of the race and the class and the story and moves to biographies, that's when he separates himself from the Pharisees, from the religious elites in the story that are so busy using I just wonder how many, of these first two guys, did either of them go to like their priest or their temples and use this scenario as a talking point? Because isn't that what we would do in 2017? Something we see on the road, something we see on the news becomes the talking point to sort of further our view on a particular topic. All the while, we're not really doing anything about that particular topic. And we're not invested in the work. So when this guy moves from ideology to biography and moves past the blind spots and moves past sort of the conditioning to get off of his donkey and do something, that's when we start to see solution. That's when we start to see the real go and do likewise. So what's the application? The application is, obviously, empathy is possible when we're willing to share experiences. But probably the harder pull, but the one that I think is the one that I'm going to invite you to participate in tonight is, are we willing to share the understandings of what other people are enduring or going through? So when we hear these things like the Urbanology Part 1, when we talked about segregation, deindustrialization, suburbanization, mass incarceration, gentrification, it's likely that you could find your favorite analyst or your favorite person with which you agree that would tell you all the reasons why that's the greatest thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. The understanding part of this, the understanding part of empathy goes, what must it have been like to be in that particular position? What must it have been like? What tensions must have been going through the minds of the people involved? And that is the harder part of this conversation, right? All three guys saw someone laying in the street, left for dead. All of us probably in this room, again, because we're not the crazies now, acknowledge that in 2017, we do not live in a post-racial society. We're very keenly aware of the tensions that exist culturally. But are we willing to move past, again, the initial filter of our world, which goes, if everyone just saw the world the way I did, it would be a better place, to entering into the pain and the experience of other people, not just ideologically, but relationally? Right? What if we believe that structural racism exists because we actually are in community with people who are feeling the effects of it? That's a distinction. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says this, "Therefore, if anyone's in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, the new is here." Love that verse. "All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation," that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. "And he committed us the message of reconciliation." There it is again. "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God." So beautiful picture of reconciliation offered us there in light of what Jesus has done for us. And so one of the most beautiful passages that clearly illustrates the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I love it. But reconciliation as it relates to empathy is a word I think that's kind of been hijacked. Right? And what I mean by that is, reconciliation, I think, in 2017 has sort of meant like sort of the trite version of can't we all just get along? Not from a place of pain, not because the person that said that, and it was coined in the 90s, Rodney King, was not saying it from a place of platitude and cliche, a place of real brokenness and pain. We have made the conversation about reconciliation. Well, if the children of the world would just join hands in harmony, everything would be peachy, right? Have you ever tried to sing harmony? Harmony's hard. Harmony requires listening. If we tried to harmonize tonight, and I've got some friends in this room that are musicians and band folks, bad harmony like derails things. Harmony requires listening and conditioning and kind of coming together and the blending of things, where you have two distinct things that they're both distinct, but they're coming together to make beautiful music. It slows you down. You actually have to listen. You can't just like chime in over the top. We won't make good music together if that's the case. Reconciliation is not just this kind of like neat, tidy, well, if we just kind of hold hands tonight and love each other, it'll all be good. It's way messier than that, friends. Did you realize that this whole passage is describing Jesus had to die for reconciliation to take place? There's a death in reconciliation, a death to my rights, my way of seeing the world, my privilege, my understanding of the world would be better if blank. He uses this phrase, in describing reconciliation, the illustration of ambassador is used. Let me just point out two things about ambassadors. They suffer and they're sent. They suffer in the sense that they feel homesick, right? They give up what it means to be like a Marylander, right? If I'm the ambassador to Venezuela, right? And I'm spending time and I'm trying to figure out what it means to contextualize the things I want to do in representing my country to another group of people, which means I have to think about how they might hear the thing that I'm sending to them, right? Think about things as an ambassador. There's a sending and there's a suffering. In this idea of the sending, there's symbols. There's things that carry weight. Have you ever like put yourself in a moment where there's like a cultural faux pas that you committed and you didn't know that you'd committed it? I said something once to two women who were from Colombia. I made a reference that like made the room gasp. I was talking about food. I made a euphemism that was absolutely filthy in their language. And they could not believe that I, a pastor, would joke about such a thing. And I'm like, what are we talking about? Like, I learned in that moment that there was a phrasing that was neutral to me that was like deeply, deeply offensive to them, right? An ambassador has to navigate that kind of dysfunction, right? If I'm only interested in my perspective, I'm like, well, that's stupid. You should shut up and do things my way. Or, I didn't mean anything. What's the deal? You know, I obviously had offended them. So I had to say, I'm sorry, can you help me understand why that phrasing was offensive to you? Because obviously it was not my intent to offend you. That's what we're talking about here when we're talking about sending. Are we willing to relationally kind of get off our donkey and go, hey, I don't know what I can do, but I've got to do something. Help me kind of understand the situation. So it comes with the admission that when we go back to that map of Baltimore, not everyone sees things the way that we do in our particular neighborhood. Not everyone sees justice even through the lens that you might see that. And if we're going to be an ambassador, what it means is we might have a truth or we might have an opinion about how that gets carried out, but we walk that out humbly in relationships, seeking first to understand versus being understood. All right? I'll just use this example. There's a cross on my alma mater, Kentucky Christian University's campus, right in the center of the campus. And I can tell you that for many people, it's a place that probably they come back to as like this Old Testament Ebenezer of this moment where probably God showed up in a huge way. I'm guessing someone committed to go be a missionary in China at that cross. I'm guessing someone proposed to their girlfriend at that cross. I'm guessing there's someone that God showed up in a tangible way at that cross, and they come back and they walk their kids around it, and there's a moment, and they probably have a hymn sing or something like that. I mean, it is a beautiful memorial to Jesus at the center of the campus. You know what it represents to me? The worst moment of my adult life. The hardest things I've ever been told about myself, half of which weren't true. You see, a girl ended our engagement at that cross, handed back a ring, said, "You're not good enough for me." When I see that cross, not the cross of Christ, but that cross on KCU's campus, you know, it's a big middle finger to me that says, "You're not good enough, and you weren't good enough." It's a symbol that's neutral, that inspires a different reaction in me than it does to other people that have had different experiences in that place, okay? When we talk about being an ambassador, we talk about moving from my angsty posture of like, can't you see this is a place where relationships die? To help me understand what God did there. Or to the person that thinks this is the most magical spot where nothing bad could ever happen. I go, well, let me give you a quick exception. Probably good in the long run, but it really hurt back then. Okay? Being an ambassador means we're willing to step into the world of others and say, hey, how are you interpreting the symbols, the messages, the things that we're hearing in this time? Stephen Covey says that one of the 7 habits of highly effective people is seeking first to understand versus being understood. Culturally, we love to make other people understand what we're thinking, right? It's the mic drop conversation. Facebook, I'll just leave this here, right? Without any willingness to understand where someone else is coming from. That happens on the right, that happens on the left, happens everywhere in between. Happens on conversations about justice, but we can see why it's dangerous for something about talking like structural racism. That's why it's hard for us. Some of us have the blind spot of, well, I don't understand why people think that I'm not for justice. Well, do you seek first to understand what other people are going through? Did you know Joey Adams? Joey Adams was the singer of the national anthem for the Baltimore Ravens. And he recently, in light of all of kind of the flag conversations, resigned from that post. Now, the interesting part of this was I saw it as clickbait, you know, for people that were sort of defending why people needed to stand for the national anthem. Like, here, you made the guy from the Ravens resign. Way to go, people. Yeah, way to go, Cap. It's always helpful to read the article. Here's what was interesting about his statement about why he resigned. He said, fans who attack players for protesting, a right in which I fought to defend because he's a veteran, but are simply not interested in understanding why, is the reason why I'm resigning. What's he saying there? I don't want to be your prop. I don't want to be your talking point. I don't want to be I'll just leave this here. I want you to understand why we're having this conversation. Now, the flag is obviously, in our current moment, eliciting a huge reaction. To Miriam, my 90-year-old friend who's a World War II vet, it means one thing. To someone who has experienced some of the sting of segregation, mass incarceration, police brutality, some of the things that we talked about the last time around. It could mean something entirely different. But are we willing to enter into the pain of others? That's what it means to be an ambassador. The guy in this story wants to justify himself. Did you catch that? The person asking Jesus, what he's looking for is like, no, man, you got this. Way to go. You're the exception. Our what-about-isms are kind of like that. They're usually attempts to sort of justify ourselves. And if we could get anything out of this conversation tonight, is are we willing to enter in to the difficult conversations people are having in this time? Are we seeking first to really understand other people and what they're dealing with when people are saying, hey, there's inequity, hey, we're feeling the sting, hey, we're feeling the pain of, are we willing to enter that? If you're a man, you should be doing that right now, you know? Just culturally, there's a moment where ladies are talking about some things that we would probably rather not hear. If you haven't seen the Me Too kind of hashtag series, it's a moment where for a guy, there's an opportunity to go, are we going to go, yeah, but, well, what about blah, blah, blah? Or are we going to go, whoa, I just did not even see that part of the world because I don't have to navigate it. That's what we're talking about. So are we willing to enter into a spirit of sending? That's what it means to be an ambassador. And are we willing to suffer? Okay? So ideologies without biographies. Austin's going to give us kind of the idea. And I actually think this is, in this next clip here, I think there's a temptation in this room for probably not be uninformed. I actually think that probably when we think about the demographics of this room, I don't have to probably I probably spent more time building a case for why some of this stuff exists than I needed to. I probably could shave 5 minutes off the talk because you're probably pretty savvy in these conversations. But I actually think that exposes another problem. It's the problem of sitting up on my donkey talking about all the problems of the world, but being unwilling to get my hands dirty, which I actually think is the part of this conversation that we need to enter, and kind of where I'll end up spending with my remaining time the rest of our time. So we need to avoid being the woke police. Jordan's going to tell us more about that.
The most difficult people on the planet are the woke police, the people who have suddenly stumbled into this new knowledge of how things are, and then they turn into Pharisees, and they just start to demean anyone who doesn't understand situations as well as they do. Usually people go to social media with it, and social media is a terrible tool for any conversation like this. One, it actually makes people feel like they're more active than what they do. There's a theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez. He says, he has a question, he says, so you say you care about the poor? Please tell me what are their names? And most people who tweet about stuff or write Facebook posts about all the injustices, they know the big names. You've heard of Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, and all of this. If you really care, do you really care about mass incarceration? Great, tell me some names. Who are we talking about? We cannot have ideologies that are detached from biographies, because that is the quickest way to become a Pharisee. You'll just have an idea of what things should be or shouldn't be, but you're not actually invested in the work. Secondly, there's a scripture in John 16, Jesus tells his disciples, hey, there are many things that you need to hear, but you cannot stand to hear them now. I think to be loving in a time like this is telling people information in a way and in a manner that they could actually receive it. So if you have family members and friends that are not as woke and as aware and as amazing as you are, don't block them on Facebook. Do not hide their statuses. It's your work. This is your work. They're not going to listen to me, but they will listen to you. And they're not going to listen to you on Facebook with a really snarky post that you put up, but actually take them out to lunch when you get back to town. Ask them out. Ask them how they're doing. Ask them about their kids. Send them a picture of something that's going on with your family, and then engage with them in a way and in a manner that they could actually handle and tolerate, because that's a loving thing to do. In Ephesians 5, it says, don't let any corrupt communication fly out your mouth, only that which is helpful. And one of the things that I've always been challenged with is the standard for Christian communication is not just what's truthful. That's just the bottom basement, first level, but what is helpful. So if you have acquired some more knowledge, then the next question is, what about what I'm saying is helpful to this person, and why is it helpful for them? And I think that helps frame the conversation. It makes you talk a whole lot less, but the words that you do say are a lot more meaningful.
You love the poor, please tell me what are their names. We got to get off our donkey, right? King James that real quick, and you'll make it even more memorable, all right? Right? You love the poor, please tell me what are their names. See, there's a danger in this room that maybe we do maybe a pretty good job talking about the problems in our city, detached from the biographies of people who are facing those particular issues in our city, right? The essence of the gospel message is that Jesus stepped down into the biography of you and I, right? How much more so then are we who, maybe having strong opinions, wanting to see reconciliation come to bear, called to step down into some of the actual hurts that are going on. Reverend Tracy Blackman says this, is that outrage is easy, endless dialogue is a tool of the privileged. So we can't have ideologies without biographies. We've got to step into the midst, into the lives of people who are actually experiencing our hurt. So with that, we're going to take just a quick 3 or 4 minute break, okay? We're going to come back. We have about 20 more minutes left. We will get you out of here on time. We'll have a few minutes of conversation to follow. Apologize for our technical difficulties on the front end. But why don't you, if you need to stretch your legs, you need to get a glass of water, come back. We've got one more section, and then we'll kind of land the plane.
Feel free if you guys want to grab a water right now, or you can walk around if you need to stretch your legs or use the bathrooms or whatnot. They're a little hike to get to, so obviously we know it'll take a second for people to get back from them. So kind of the last talking point we wanted to talk about here is just how can we understand our limitations, and how can we do this over the long haul? Scott talked about, he kind of closed out our last session of Urbanology by just saying that we can't solve hundreds of years of systemic issues in one evening. And the reality is that's the case again tonight. That's the case probably tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And instead, we need to figure out how we can build bridges and fill gaps, how we can expose ourselves to our own biases and the tendencies of our world and of our country and the systemic issues that are here, and try to set ourselves up so we can make a lasting impact as opposed to just talking about it or going and serving once and doing something about it one time. And the reality is, when we approach this conversation, I think we have to be honest with ourselves and admit that we are one human. We each are just one human. And there's only so much that we can each do. And even in that, we will get tired, and we will get frustrated, and we will get weary. We may feel loneliness or the criticism and the critiquing, or even the rejection that Scott talked about. And I think if this is you today, if this is you as you are continuing to figure out your own biases and fight for it, that you feel rejected, that you feel like you're struggling to connect, I would say turn to Jesus. Jesus is a man who was on this earth and was rejected by pretty much everyone, culminating with some of his best friends rejecting him. And when we feel this way, I think it's important that we turn to healthy approaches rather than trying to stop the fighting by coping in different ways, right? Maybe it's some of the ways that we talk about more often than not of alcohol or overeating, which are ways that sometimes we cope for situations. Maybe it's we busy ourselves so we don't see it. Maybe it's busy in another form. We put our earbuds in while we're walking down the street so we don't have to interact with the person that we don't want to interact with. Maybe it's we turn to comedy. I don't know if you're like me, but when I feel cynical, I make a lot of jokes to feel better about it. Because then I don't have to feel the sting of what actually happened, and I feel a little bit good inside. Maybe it's we distance ourselves relationally from people or detach from people. And I would encourage you, let's not turn to those coping mechanisms, but instead let's lean in. and let's begin to have this empathy. James in the Bible talks, one of the most common quoted passages from that Bible is be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. And I think it's important here that we focus on that third part, to be slow to become angry. In this situation, it's understandable if we get angry. But that's slow. It's a slow process. He doesn't say don't ever get angry. We see that with Jesus as well when Jesus enters into the temple and he sees men selling animals that are being used for sacrifices. And what does he do? He walks over and he flips over the table. Jesus was pretty angry in that moment. But that was not who he was. That was not a defining characteristic about him. But he was angry that God was being treated in that way and that these people were getting taken advantage of. With all that in mind, Jordan's got a clip here about just understanding our limitations and realizing how we want to be in it for the long haul. So check this out.
Yeah, we have to recognize our limitations. There's a story about these women during a revolution, and they're on the porch drinking tea. And there's a young buck who comes up, and he comes in for a week, and he's like, how dare you sit down and drink tea during the middle of a revolution? And they said, like, son, you're going to be in and out in a week, but we're going to be here for the next couple of decades, and unless we drink tea and sit on this porch and talk and laugh, we're not going to have energy to do anything. There are a number of self-care practices that have to be maintained. I personally am very unlikely to watch another video of a cop shooting someone because it decimates me. Like, it absolutely cripples me, and I physically, I get a physical reaction to it. It makes me less likely to want to be around anybody that's not black because I start to just feel anxiety and unsafe. And it just makes me so angry. And it, in a lot of ways, it puts a deeper fear inside of me than I think is warranted. So I don't watch videos of shootings because it's not good to watch. Like, what does it, I always ask myself, what will this add? If it's like a question of what happened and I want to be in the know, then maybe. And this is not a universal rule, but for me, secondly, I think people can get accustomed to seeing this and then it becomes normalized. So part of the reason they would always have these whole rallies and parties around lynchings was because it was a normalized thing, and you would see pictures of like 9-year-olds smiling at lynchings, and I guarantee they weren't smiling at the first one, but eventually, over and over and over again, we become desensitized to things, and I think keeping our sensitization, whatever that word is, maintaining our feeling, that we can still feel how profoundly painful this experience is paramount. I think watching too much videos and engrossing yourself too much in a day-by-day, minute-by-minute stuff. I mute a whole lot of terms on Twitter. I like to go on Twitter, particularly during football season, just to rail against the Jets. And I need spaces where I'm not constantly hearing about some political administration, constantly hearing about this happened, or constantly hearing about a shooting or something, because it's too much for me. And then it just turns me into a jaded, angry, fearful person. And there's a balance between being in the know and overwhelming yourself. But if we think that we have unlimited emotional energy, we're lying to ourselves.
Yeah, so here, obviously, we're talking about our limitations. We're talking about if we just run at 100 miles an hour 24/7, we're going to fall on our face. If we think that we can, run a marathon at a sprinter's pace, we're going to be exhausted after a mile. We're not going to make it the full distance, and instead we're going to stop. So what are some practical ways we can do this? I came up with just a couple. This is not an exhaustive list. You probably can come up with other ones if you just sit down and think about it, how you can tangibly make a difference long term. The first one is this, we need to adjust and examine our calendars. I would guess the majority of us in this room run at an unhealthy pace, even if we're not talking about this. We run at a pace that we are hardly keeping up with, and that everyone around us, or maybe not around us, is going like, what are you doing? This is nuts. How is this sustainable? And so if we want to make an impact, we obviously have to look at our schedules, and we have to ask the question of, am I prioritizing empathy? Am I prioritizing those relationships that I care about? You care about the poor, what are their names? How are we prioritizing time for the people described there, right? Second one is this, is we need to figure out ways to Sabbath and rest well. I don't think we're a culture that typically rests well. We're typically a culture that, will binge watch TV, but after that, you never feel great, you never feel fulfilled. Instead, or we work 7 days a week after week after week. We don't take days off very well as well. And if we want to make an impact long term, it's important for us to find those times of rest and to figure out how to rest in ways that are re-energizing us to get us back out there. Next one is this, lean on friends. I love the story here of these two ladies sitting on the porch drinking tea together, knowing that they need to take a step back and leaning on one another. Knowing that in that moment, there are probably moments, you put yourself in that situation where you're sitting there having a drink with a friend, and there are probably moments that they're going to call you out on something where you're going, you're not doing a great enough job here. And there's probably other moments where they're going, man, keep it up. Like, you don't hear this enough, but you need to keep it going because you're doing a good thing. We need that space in our lives, and sometimes if we go back to, again, adjusting our calendars, we don't create that space for people to speak into our lives. We also need to have some inward renewal. Obviously, this is talking about two different folds. This is talking about the biblical Bible taking hold on our hearts. It's prayer, it's spiritual disciplines, but it's also taking time for hobbies and taking care of ourselves, our souls. And the last one I'll say is this, is kind of the last thing that Jordan was talking about, is avoiding desensitization and asking the question of, what is this going to add to my life if I do it? Right? We can become desensitized to things so quickly. I remember there's someone that goes to the Foundry that had just gotten out of school, nursing school, and they were working in the ER. And weeks 1 and 2, he would come to our small group, and he would just have this prayer request of like, I feel like I'm already getting desensitized to the fact that these are human lives, some of which are dying right in front of me. And the reality is we've done that with so many people. We've become desensitized to them. And so we need to ask the question of, what do we need to do to have our senses alert? And what is it adding to our lives? Because we want to make an impact over the long haul. We don't want to make an impact just for today or tomorrow. We want to make it the full marathon, where we are making an impact each and every day. I think one of the hardest things about that is sometimes we don't see the fulfillment of our work. Right? We obviously, names like Martin Luther King, who was killed and didn't see even how far we've come today from the day he was assassinated. We read about a guy in the Bible like Moses, who was asked to lead the Israelites to the promised land. And for 40 years, he led them and never stepped foot in the promised land. I think that's one of the hardest things that we have to come to grips with here, is just knowing that God can use us. We can have empathy, but we may not see it come to full fruition. So I'm going to leave you with these two questions, and then Scott's going to come up and just conclude our time. But these are just two things I want you to think about. How do you need to adjust your calendar to make a difference over the long haul? What changes need to be made there? And the second one is this. Look at your life and ask the question of, where have I become desensitized? Or who have I become desensitized to? So with that, Scott's going to close us out with the conclusion here.
So at this point, I don't know if you're like, wow, this is the most amazing thing ever, or if this is like incredibly frustrating. Because it's incredibly frustrating, I think, in the sense that if you came tonight looking for like a 10-point plan, you don't have it. So far you've been told you've got to move past your way of seeing the world as the right way, right? The genogram of like, I was raised to believe XYZ about XYZ, and when I'm confronted with a person lying on the road, I'm prone to project my projections on that situation. We said second, we got to get off the donkey, right? We've actually got to get down and get the biography there And then lastly, what Austin just really talked about was stewardship. The Good Samaritan has his stuff in order, to where his credit's good. He's got some stuff, he's got some supplies to go. I mean, we're really having a stewardship conversation about soul care. How do we steward our lives in this fast-paced 24-hour news cycle where fear is being perpetuated and fueled? How do we keep ourselves thick-skinned but soft-hearted? That is a challenge. I mean, right there, I'll just confess to you many times of just being like, I'm just so tired of hearing one more thing, and I feel helpless, right? Do you feel helpless? So this isn't, again, I guess, a neat, tidy 24-point plan for how the Foundry is going to solve systemic racism in Baltimore. Or even become a more multicultural expression of the gospel, which is certainly a long-term hope that we have. All right? But what we can begin to, as we kind of filter down and apply, I want to offer a couple just sort of applications of this conversation about empathy, and I'll move through them fairly quickly, and then we'll take some questions. I think the first here is, again, if we can summarize this, we'd say listen and learn. Listen and learn. Where do you need to listen and learn? There's an area of your world where there's a blind spot. Maybe you were exposed to it tonight. Maybe you're not yet convinced you have it, right? So if you're a guy and you're like, I honor women, maybe you need to keep listening. If you are a person that goes, well, I'm not racist, but you probably need to keep listening. Where do you need to keep listening? I think we're all people that fancy ourselves the person that when the Nazis are coming, we're hiding Anne Frank. And we're giving our life. But the Good Samaritan shows us that even religion and busyness have the ability to blind us to justification. Right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who actually stood up to Hitler and lost his life in the process, did some listening and learning. You're like, how does Dietrich Bonhoeffer move to a place where in Nazi Germany he's got the wherewithal to give his life and endure what he endured in the face of such pure, unadulterated evil? One of the things Bonhoeffer points to is being in Harlem in the 1930s and just listening and observing in his theological training in New York City how black men in New York City were navigating the civil rights movement of the 1930s, which was hardly then probably at the fullest momentum of the movement. Watching them navigate what life looked like as a black man in New York City, progressive place, was one of the things even Bonhoeffer credits as one of the things that sort of moved him when he got back to Germany to knowing, wow, I got to do something. And in the 20th century, he's one of the few kind of most notable of theologians even addressing sort of the kind of the post-Jim Crow, Reconstruction, Great Migration era, imbalance to the structural equality of America. Bonhoeffer did that because he listened and he learned, right? So relationally, where do you maybe need to lean in? The next time something happens, it's a polarizing, hot-button topic. Perhaps one of the people you should have coffee with, not Facebook banter with, is someone that might see that situation differently than you. Seek first to understand, to listen, and to learn. Match what's breaking your heart to where you are listening and learning. Okay, match what's breaking your heart to where you are listening and learning. Second, lament and repent. What do I mean by that? Soul care is important. Part of soul care is moving past everything's beautiful and nothing hurts. It's not good soul care to never cry. And it's not good soul care to never be moved, to have your heart broken. 40% of the Old Testament Psalms are Psalms of lament. Dear God, why is this happening? Dear God, I feel the sting of this world. If you're leaning in and you're listening, perhaps 40% of your prayers are going to be, dear God, this person is hurting. Dear God, what's going on out there? Lamenting and repenting. There's three filters I think we could think this through. Individually, what are people in my life? What am I feeling? What am I going through? Interpersonally, people who I'm in relationship with. And then institutionally, what are people going through and experiencing? The book Blind Spot calls it identifying your mind bugs. The Bible calls it repentance, right? Seeing the things that are breaking your heart when you are confronted with biased ways or improper ways of seeing or reacting to that situation, confessing that to God, repenting unto God. 2 Corinthians 10:5, I think it's in your notes, but I'll read it to you really quickly. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. In these conversations that we're having as a culture, individually, there has to be a willingness for us to take these thoughts that we're having, okay? Animosity, frustration, lament, and go, God, help me filter that through the cross of Christ so that I don't resort to shame, pain avoidance, or just triumphalism, right? Like the world's burning, but I have a $4 latte, so I'm good, right? Or boy, if we can just get this political party in office, the ills of Baltimore City, right, will be solved. Or if we just get Under Armour to do a little bit more than they're already doing, well, boy, then we'll just solve the issue. But I'm gonna just sip my tea. We lament, repent. Lastly, we leverage our influence. We leverage our privilege. So, and this is where I'm actually going to land, and we're going to end right at 8:30 when I say this. We listen, we lament, and then we can begin to offer ourselves. The gifts I have, the resources I have, the ears that I have, perhaps the people that I know, how can I utilize that to be empowering to people that are on the fringes, right? So if you're in this room and you have a political office of some sort, there's probably an overt like, oh yeah, I get it, right? For some of us, it's maybe more nuanced than that. If you mentor, though, right? That's privilege. That's influence that you're leveraging to learn and to grow and to impact and to advocate. Right? And if you're not sure where you could leverage your influence, then perhaps one of the conversations here is back to point number 3, how do we address our calendars to do that, right? If you live on a block where these conversations are happening, it's perhaps a little bit easier than if you live on a block that's sort of isolated from these conversations that are going on culturally, right? But you have leverage and influence and privilege somewhere. Despite your socioeconomic status, despite your race, despite your age, despite your marital status, you have influence and privilege. Are you leveraging it to be part of a shalom picture of justice, a go and do likewise, or are you just kind of busy going, I don't know, I don't think it's me, but I think this guy over here, I think he's got it, he can do it, right? I'll end there, and I'll end with this story. My hope is, in both of these urbanologies, there's a really interesting interview between Alex Haley and Martin Luther King that happened in 1965. And Alex Haley asks Martin Luther King, what did you make any mistakes in this pursuit of justice? And he says this, I mean, it like guts me to read it. He goes, the most pervasive mistake I made was believing that because our cause was just, we would be sure that white ministers of the South, once their Christian consciences were challenged, would rise to our aid. I felt that white ministers would take our cause to the white power structure. I ended up, of course, chastened and disillusioned. As our movement unfolded and direct appeals were made to white ministers, most folded their hands and even took stands against us. See, we all think we'd march on Selma. We all think we would go the extra mile with Dr. King. That's not Dr. King's experience. And then he says this, let me hasten to say that there were some outstanding exceptions. I want to be a church of outstanding exceptions. I want to be a church of outstanding exceptions. We're not going to do it perfectly. We're not going to do it right every time. It's why we need each other, and it's why we need to continue to have these conversations. It's 8:30, and if you need to go, I certainly understand it. We have this room for a few more minutes, and so this has been a little bit more of a monologue than session one of Urbanology was, where we had you up and down the room kind of mimicking the suburbs and all that good stuff. As we close tonight, I'll just kind of move it to what conversation, if you need to go, good night, thank you for being here. But I would like to turn it to, hey, are there questions or conversations we want to begin to have kind of out of the information that we shared tonight? Yeah, go for it, Joshua.
Could you talk about how, I'm thinking being married and as a husband, thinking about my wife and some of the conversations that came out of session one.
Yeah.
Talk about like white flight and leaving because of a sense potentially of neighborhoods becoming less safe and that decision
Yeah.
of, like, you're also thinking about the safety of your family.
Yeah.
Or when families are having conversations around the quality of their schools and making
Yeah.
a decision, do I go to a different area to seek out a better education? Like how we as Christians can be just wrapping our heads around that and what guidance God would give to parsing that out.
Amazing question. Amazing question. I think I would go back in the first point to say, one of the things that's tough about that conversation is because it forces us to confront some of the biases we have, right? So if you grew up in the suburbs and you liked your upbringing, one of your biases is that the perfect way to raise a family is a suburban house with 2-car garage and travel across. And now if you grew up in that and your parents were like the plot of American Beauty, that means not good. By the way, like perfect suburban facade, but everything under it was like a seedy, dark underbelly of like cesspool of terrible things. Then you might go, oh, the worst place you could ever raise your kid is the suburbs, right? So I think the first part of that is I think there's a very low and slow kind of crock pot versus microwave conversation that we've got to be willing to have with our significant other, spouse, about, as we're making this decision, what are we confronting in ourselves? Filtering that through, okay, God, as we're confronting that thing of the ideal upbringing, what have you called us to do? Have you called us to pioneer a work in a place where, boy, we're doing this by ourselves? Do we have the capacity to do that? Or does where we live right now, can we leverage our influence and our privilege in a particular way? I think I'll say maybe the waterfront community of Baltimore would struggle in this equation is I think in that first point they just jump to, well, you can't. Because have you seen, they jump to the judgmental map of Baltimore, right? The most frequently asked question I got from people I think I've told some of you this question. I had an older woman in Harford County shake her finger at me and say, God would never call you as a Christian man into the city because you are a father. And God would never call you as a father to raise your kids in a school in Baltimore City, right? Overt bias. She knows nothing about our school. And frankly, she probably hadn't been in the city since about 1968. It exposed something. But it also reminded me of, I carried some overt things. Now, so in a complementary marital relationship, you help each other's blind spots, right? If you're a person that moves and makes decisions at 150 miles an hour, and your significant other or spouse is more of a 55, the speed limit, that's a great compliment. My wife wanted to learn about the schools, see about the schools, investigate the schools. And actually Baltimore's got some pretty great resources in how you can do that. Not just random great schools score assessments. But like the Downtown Baltimore Family Alliance is a great organization, I think, for helping assess with like the school fairs and stuff that they do. That's actually, I think it's a really good example. But I think you start with that idea of like, in that conversation, what is it I'm confronting in myself? And then out of that, what is getting down off the donkey? Like, what do I have at my resource allocation that I can offer in this season and time? I don't think with 30 different people in the room, the 30 answers won't be the same. God will call some people to stay for a really long time. And other people, God's transferring to Texas, and it happens to be to a suburban context or something like that. It's, I think we're prone. I mean, my bias is that the city is awesome, but our school experience has been awesome. So that's been it's been a pretty good deal for us. So lengthy answer, but that's a really good application question, I think, to this. Someone else could chime in there too if you want. I think that's someone wants to retort to that or even rebut me on it, like.
The only thing I'd add there is just, I think a lot of times we view schools in the same way that we view the judgmental map of Baltimore, and that's not always the case. There is, Scott's girls go to a great school. Thomas Johnson is a great, great school. But there are people who suffer from poverty that are in their school, and that there's still a high rate of kids that need help with lunch.
Yeah, I've been told, well, of course you go to a great school because you live in a white neighborhood where there's wealth. I'm like, okay, well, there's definitely wealth in my neighborhood. And per the world map, I guess I'm wealthy. But like, it's about as reductionist as saying, well, the schools in Towson are awesome. Do I know that every school in Towson is awesome because the socioeconomic, and then what qualifies as awesome? I think that's the other conversation, right? I once had a property owner in Baltimore go, I can't tell you what's a good place to live because good's subjective. Your picture of good is skewed by your experience, right? So, if I lived in a very small place and I grew up impoverished in another country, maybe Haiti, my house in West Baltimore on a block of vacants otherwise might feel like a palace. That's a weird thing to maybe for us to say, but like if that represents maybe a different level of safety or security than we had at another point in time, then where you might go, I could never. So yeah, I think that we have to. I think this is a really good filter for that conversation, like because that conversation kicks up some initial like city schools are. Or neighborhoods where I get a little more square footage, but a little, less cost equals blank. And I think that's probably a good place. And I think, again, like some of those, do some of the qualifications of our neighborhood on the judgmental map of Baltimore apply? Perhaps. But there's a danger in just making the decisions to where God's sending us in the ascension of evading comfort. Thanks for the question, Joshua. I think that's a great one. What else does it kick up? Cool. Well, again, if you came looking for a 24-point plan, I don't have it for you. The last page has got some resources. One of those resources is called the Multi-Ethnic Primer. Our next step as a church is kind of twofold. Number one, there's a conference in November called Ethnos that the Foundry is a kind of a co-sponsor of at the Village Church in Hamden. If it's of interest to you, we're going to start putting the link up for it. That's another good, just continued listening and learning conversation. There's also a thing there called the Multi-Ethnic Primer that we're considering kind of organizing a small, it's kind of more of a practical conversation of what do we begin to do with this stuff that we've learned together this fall. If that's of interest to you and you'd be interested in participating in that group, not only do we have the books tonight and you can take a look at the book and peruse it, but you can let me know. I'll probably host that more of in an online forum than a live class just for the sake of stewarding time. All right?
If you want that, it's $15.
Yeah, it's a 15. Yeah. So no obligation tonight, but if long-term that's of something that you would want to consider participating in, certainly would welcome you to do that. All right? Thanks for hanging, and look forward to continuing this conversation with you.